Hello, everybody. I'd like to invite you to the iGEM 2020. I'm George Ivey from Ivey International. I'd like to thank the Canadian Trade Commission Service for inviting me to be a part of this event and iGEM organizers for the same. Today, I'm going to be talking on a very interesting topic called soil and groundwater remediation impacts on climate change. And the thing to really understand when you're dealing with climate change, a lot has to deal with sustainable activities that we as humans are doing and how that can affect environmental consequences as far as what we use, waste we generate, and so on and so forth. And directly and indirectly, that does have an effect on climate change. So I'll be talking a lot about sustainable remediation using our products and how we enhance remediation with that net sustainability effect and how that overall improves the environment for all of us to live in. Just a second here, advancing my slides. So all I'm showing in these couple images here are just showing waste before and after. And on the right-hand side, you're actually seeing contaminants which are chlorinated, think like PCBs and like this. They're very heavy. They tend to sink in water. They're difficult to treat, and we can actually get those out of contaminated soil and groundwater. Here's another image from a contaminated soil, some refinery before and after treatment. So we found ways of using innovation, basically manipulating chemistry. You'll learn a little bit about myself in the next couple of slides and how I've been able to do that in innovative ways to help improve remediation and bring out sustainability and improve the way we're doing things such that we're generating much less waste. As far as this presentation goes, we have the copyright on it. However, we're sharing it through this platform with you. And I'd like to share with everybody, in June of this year, we won a top 10 Environmental Technology Solution Provider Award nationally in the United States. So just happy to share that with you. And we'll move on. Something that's really important to understand is who we are. The company's actually been around this year, is our 26th year in business. Just want to share that with you. So it's a nice little celebration for us here at the office. Ivey's a company that's based in Western Canada, but we work globally. We're also known as an international award remediation company for developing technologies to help improve soil, groundwater, sediment remediation. And the products that we're most well known for is the Ivey soft surfactant remediation technology, and another product we developed for decontaminating equipment like tank cleaning and things like this called Deconit. Our products are biodegradable, non-caustic, non-corrosive, and are very, very friendly to the environment. We've gained global recognition for the guaranteed capacity of our products to work. It's not like we're going to try to do something and hope it works. No, we try it and we have very good success and predictability what the results are going to be. And we develop things to deal with a broad range of contamination. So it's not like gasoline and diesel spills. We don't stop there. There's things such as chlorinated solvents, pesticides, insecticides. There's even an emerging contaminant called PFAS, which is like that firefighting foam with polyfluorinated compounds, which is really getting a lot of attention in places like Australia. I'm sure it's coming your way. It's getting a lot of attention in Europe and North America. So we've even developed ways to deal with that. And even things called organometallics, so like metals with organic groups on them. They're quite toxic. We've even found ways of treating those. So there's new emerging contaminants of concern or waste or impacts to our environment. We found neat ways to actually improve their remediation, enhance them. And by enhancing things technologically, we can save on the amount of resources that are required to do them and the overall debt to the environment. So there's huge time and cost savings when we're dealing with soil and groundwater remediation. And I'm happy to say we've been powering remediation globally for over 25 years. Now, a little bit about myself, because you're listening to me for the next better part of an hour. I've had some people jokingly in North America, if you've ever seen that TV show called Breaking Bad, Walter's a chemist. And he seems to do a lot of things that are kind of neat and interesting. So I've been jokingly called Walter by some people. And what I've developed is, through my ability and my background, is to break some rules of chemistry. I make chemicals behave in ways they don't want to, or make water behave in a way it doesn't want to. Like a lot of people think water is H2O. Well, actually, it's not. And there's things that are insoluble. Well, I can make them soluble in a very controlled way. And in doing so, I can improve our ability to treat contaminated water or groundwater or soils or sediments, which otherwise are a waste. And if we can actually clean these, we can reuse them to a higher and better purpose. And I found ways of improving physical, chemical, and biological processes. And by the way, that's the only three we have. That's it. So I found ways of improving those, whether we're doing stuff above ground treatment or actually underground. So we've done a lot of really neat things to improve those, because that's what everyone's doing. If you're dealing with environmental consultants or contractors, they're trying to find ways to improve these things sustainably. So they impact the environment, you and I, even from issues of cost, to improve those. My background is I'm an synthetic organic chemist, type of guy that could go into the lab and make a heart drug. So I have a really strong, intimate understanding about how chemicals behave. And after that, I thought about working in the environmental field, and I didn't really have a lot of engineering or geology experience. So I realized I had to get some additional education in that area, and I did. And later, I went on and got a master's in project management. I've been actually working in this field for 29 years now. So that's been a lot of fun. My work has taken me to over 50 countries in the world, working on more than 2,500 major assessment and remediation projects. So you learn an awful lot and you try a lot of things. And as a consequence of that, I've developed a lot of technology. Okay, hold several international patents, and we've received many international awards, such as the one I mentioned that we received in June this year. I've even done things to let people understand who I am. It's not just the work that I do. I've even done Ironman. I very much enjoy cooking. I very much enjoy the outdoors, hiking, camping. My wife and I went for an hour run through the forest this afternoon. So those type of things are really, really fun for me. A little bit about the purpose of my presentation today in this conference and things that we're concerned with about the world and the environment is about sustainability and how we can improve climate change. We want to have better use of human resources, better use of technology like IT, computers, medical technology, even environmental treatment, soil, water, wastewater treatment, all those things are included in that. Better use of consumable resources, whether we're talking power, fuel, a whole lot of things like that. The better we use them, more efficiently we use them, the less impact we have on the environment. Then you got to think about the life cycle of products and minimize waste. If I'm dealing with a treatment system on a contaminated site, if I can treat that site in like 6 months, maybe that treatment system could be used on 10 sites versus being stuck on one site for 20 years. That would be a better use of that equipment. And then by minimizing waste, there's less waste management we have to deal with, which is a big global concern. And the more efficient we treat water, surface or groundwater, there's huge savings to be had there. More efficient treatment of soil and sediments. And they're being impacted by spills every single day. Treated water and soil that's been treated to environmental standards can be reused, sometimes for commercial uses or sometimes for agricultural uses. But the reuse of this soil is becoming a very important trend that we're getting into, as opposed to treating it as waste and sending it to a landfill and ignoring it. That doesn't work. We've got to start dealing with these things. Then there's huge time and cost savings to you and me, to industry, to governments, and ultimately to the planet. So innovative environmental treatment of impacted water, soils plays an important part in environmental sustainability, which has a positive effect on all the sustainable things we're doing to actually improve climate change. It's not just a standalone concern, climate change. It's all those sustainable things we can do to minimize that impact. And I think we're coming a long way. So one of the things I used to say when I get up in front of crowds of people, I would say, who's older, me or the environmental movement? It's an interesting question. So you might guess my age, but some things to think about. Back in April of 1970 was the first Earth Day. The US EPA was formed in December of 1970. The Australian Environmental Protection Act was drafted in 1970. Environment Canada, the country I come from, formed its environmental agency in 1971. U.S. Clean Water Act came into play in 1972, and many European Union environmental agencies formed in the 1970s. And then we saw this ongoing country after country engagement of their environment, realizing we had to do something about a concern that was mounting in the late 60s and early 70s about our environment. How are we going to manage all this waste? This is not something that's new. So quite honestly, looking at 1970 as being a really important time when a lot of regulations came into play, we're almost 50 years old. So what I find really incredible is to think that how much change has happened in just 50 years. It's crazy. I mean, I look at like the IT field and the massive changes happening there, or the medical fields. I mean, treatments for cancer, ailments, all these medications we have. It's incredible there. Well, we're actually accomplishing a tremendous amount in 50 years. If you look where we were at 1970 compared to where we are in 2020, massive change has taken place. So I have a lot of hope that we can actually do a lot of really good things and not only sustainably save our planet and deal with climate change, but make it a safer place for all of us. So let's keep going. So innovation is a really important thing for me. So I'm known for breaking the rules of chemistry. If I turn around, you can see in the back of my shirt, it actually says that on there. And I like doing that because things have a tendency of wanting to behave a certain way. You know, if a cat doesn't behave like a dog, for example. Well, contaminants have a certain way of behaving. And I realized as a chemist who did geological engineering, you know, we can influence their behavior. And if we influence their behavior in a very innovative, smart way, we can actually make them more available for physical, chemical, and biological manipulation or treatment to actually resolve those contaminants. So, hey, that's kind of interesting. So that's what I want to do, is increase their availability. I often would say is if my wife wasn't interested in dancing, I couldn't get her on the dance floor, she wouldn't be available to me to dance. Well, then we wouldn't have met each other, you know, sort of thing. Learn how water can also change the behavior of water. We all know if you jump onto water and do what's called a belly flop, ouch, it hurts your skin, because water actually holds itself together pretty tightly compared to other things. And if you can change that, it offers some opportunity in manipulating the behavior of water, especially when you're treating surface water, groundwater, and soils and sediments. You're also going to learn that because of the way we've worked with contaminants and changed their behavior, we can sustainably result in huge time and cost savings for clients. I've been on projects where we've started the project and walked away 6 months later, finished. And the time prognosis for that site was 5 to 7 years for cleanup. Massive time and cost savings for that client, not to mention legal risks or environmental liability. There's many things at play. But when those treatment systems aren't running for another 7 years, think of all the energy or power savings. Less people transporting to and from the site in their vehicles. There's many, and even those treatment systems are producing waste. Do they go to a municipal wastewater treatment plant after they're treated, or to the environment? There's a lot of things that really affect what's going on. So we can learn how to enhance water and soil remediation sustainably to ultimately impact on things such as climate change. Everything is related. One of the things I'm going to talk about today is challenge the way we look at things. We've all been taught in school that water is H2O. Well, it's not really. It's just a model for how we talk about it. So you might find that a bit strange for me to make that statement, but I'll explain it inside this presentation, and what I will show you will be true. And because of that, it's that fundamental understanding of water that I was able to manipulate it so we could actually improve soil and groundwater remediation. So chemical reactions. Everything you see these things in textbooks and whatnot, A plus B producing C. Well, that's interesting, but did you know there's greater than 99.99% of reactions do not have A plus B producing 100% of C? They actually produce a lot of byproducts. The reason we write these down is it's a simplified way of saying when we do combine A plus B, we produce C. Do you know sometimes those reactions produce maybe 20% C and the other 80% is waste? But the point is, when you're dealing with any kind of products out there, sometimes there's byproducts formed in making them or impurities. Those have environmental consequences, okay? And some of them have negative impacts on climate change, such as things getting into ozone depleting realms of how they can affect things. So there's ways for us to actually to purify those products so they can meet, you know, commercial, industrial. What about medical? That's very pure. Or food grade, that's very pure. So there are ways of purifying things, but it's just speaking the fact that don't go assuming that A plus B is going to produce 100% C. There's other things going on. It's just the way we like to look at things. I'm also going to talk about something else. Is NaCl, that table salt, that little white crystals that we like to sprinkle on food for flavor and taste, is it NaCl, one Na plus one Cl coming together? Well, the actual reality is that's not what it is. It's a way of talking about what it is. If you stop and think of each one of those little crystals, and for me to show, in the center of the crystals, there's that sodium, the Na, communicating or linked and bonding with 6 chlorides. But if you want to think of like them in terms of like a ball, you got the Na and you got these 6 chlorides around it, it's only communicating with 1/6 of each of those. So you have 1 Na with 6 times 1/6. Oh, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So all NaCl to you is saying is that they have a ratio of 1-to-1. It doesn't really tell you about how they're actually physically holding together, as you would see in this crystal lattice. So we tend to do a lot of that type of stuff when we're looking at things like water or salt or even reactions. We tend to generalize things. which is okay, and it helps us communicate, but it doesn't always explain to the person that's doing the evaluation or the remediation contaminant sites what's fundamentally going on. So me as an organic chemist, I take a more minute or molecular view on things and how I can manipulate or change those so that we can remediate sites a lot better and improve soil and groundwater remediation sustainably. Something I'm happy to say is our products are free of unwanted impurities and byproducts. There's a lot of concerns out there, things like PFOA, PFOS, those fluorinated compounds, which are getting a lot of global attention right now. We don't have them. 1,4-dioxin's a byproduct in a lot of things. We don't have that. Dioxins and furans, which are known to be cancerous, we don't have those. We've been tested and are free of every US EPA regulated compound. This is a really important thing that we've done the due diligence of verifying our products are safe for use in the environment. That's very sustainable unto itself. Forgetting that it's doing due diligence and avoiding a lot of environmental liability. We're not going to introduce a poison into the cure, as it were. We're introducing something that not only is effective, but it's safe. Our products are biodegradable to 3 international standards. That's not normal for a product or someone to do that, but we care that much. Now, when we're dealing with things that you guys tend to visualize, so I'm going to take some time here, like think if there's a spill. We think spills on the ocean, or there's a pipeline spill, or there's a spill from an above ground storage tank. They can release things such as petroleum hydrocarbons or chlorinated solvents. And these things are toxic if you and I are exposed to them. And this just shows their tendency of behaving. Some of them are lighter than water. They float on water. We know oil floats on water. If you want to put some olive oil into a glass of water, you'll see it floating. Things like chlorinated solvents, like PCBs and other certain types of pesticides, they're heavy, they sink. So what I'm trying to talk here is just about the tendency of behavior of those contaminants and my innate understanding of that, and then mix that with how they perform and behave in geology allowed me to think, hey, if contaminants behave in a certain way, and I can change their behavior so that we can work on them better physically, chemically, and biologically, we can enhance the remediation, use less energy, less time, saving our clients huge amounts of money. Okay, so that was really important to me. And a lot of people think when you're looking at these 2 images I'm showing, there's water floating or contaminants, thinking, oh, it's just based on density, or it's just based on solubility and how you interact and manipulate those. Well, it's not. There's other factors at play. And a really important one is interfacial tension. Don't worry about what that exactly means. I'll kind of explain it in a moment. But the point is, it blocks its ability to move. And if you're trying to get in there and treat it, that will hinder your ability to treat it. So I'll just move on and explain a little more of that in some slides. We know when there's a spill on the ground, maybe you can smell it in the air. That's where the vapors get in the air, which are a source of concern. If it actually gets into the soil, it's going to migrate to the soil. It hits the water and it floats. It'll float in the water and it'll move with the direction of the water. Okay. If it's heavier than water, it'll have a tendency to sink, and depending on its density will affect how far it will go. And eventually it'll hit some kind of a layer of soil or rock that it can't get through and it gets stopped. Okay, but understanding that behavior allows us, when we're evaluating it, just like a doctor evaluating a patient, we can assess that site or assess that patient better. And if we understand the contaminants they've been exposed to, it allows us to not only assess the patient better, but come up with better remedies to treat them. Okay, so that's where we're trying to go. This is a really interesting baler from a site that we worked on in Melbourne, Australia, with a consulting firm. That was actually last year. And this baler shows a lot of contamination from the top to the bottom. What's really interesting is we have some compounds in there that are floating. We have some compounds that are sinking, and we have these ones in between. What's going on? Again, by understanding that they had a whole mix of different contaminants on there and understanding how they all behaved allowed me to evaluate the problem at the site, the client, or I should say the patient, and then evaluating the patient allowed me to come up with a remedy or an approach to work with them on trying to treat the sick site and make it better. That's really what we're doing. So here I'm just showing an image of the brown being rock, and there's blue water in there. Green is basically contamination, and the kind of white is kind of vapors. And that happens on site. We get vapors that they come up into the site, you breathe them, they'll make you sick. But if you make contact, you drink that water that's good contamination, that'll obviously make you ill as well. So understanding how those contaminants behave when they spill and get into the soil and the groundwater, that's a big concern. Did you know 1 liter of gasoline will destroy 1 million liters of drinking water? Doesn't take very much. And most service stations in operation where you are or I'm at are probably realizing, people filling up their cars, probably easily having 1 liter of spills every single day. So if that reaches an area where there is water being pumped out of the ground for someone to drink, that could be a concern. Fortunately, that's not always the case, but when it is, we have to contend with it. So I wanted to find ways of removing those oils out of there, okay? And there's things that get in the way called pathway interference, and I had to deal with those because we're in the subsurface, in the geology, and there's openings in the geology or pathways, and I had to find ways to improve that remediation. Just showing some of the free product getting stuck in there, some vapors and water. So interfacial tension is, when you've ever jumped into water and done a belly flop and it hurt your skin? Well, water has a certain surface tension. It's actually 73 dynes, which is pretty high. Ethanol, which is in beer and wine, has about 21 dynes. So when you look at the surface tension of most contaminants, they're around 21 to 23, so much, much lower. So if they come into contact with each other in the subsurface and you're trying to pull the contamination through the water, sometimes get stuck. So if we could change overcome that interfacial tension and change the behavior of the contaminants so they'll become more miscible or actually dissolve a little bit, that allows you to move them or recover them and get that contaminated mass out of that soil or out of that groundwater. So it's just understanding that. And here, look at that floating product there or that sinking product. I didn't want to deal with that. And as I said before, there's all kinds of different densities of contaminants. This illustration is jokingly showing a ping pong ball sitting on lamp oil on top of rubbing alcohol. There's a soda cap in there. There's vegetable oil, water, dish soap, milk. And you're seeing all these layers because things have different densities. So they don't just immediately float or immediately sink. They tend to partition or behave in their own way. And understanding that as a chemist allows me to then determine how they'll behave when I'm trying to clean up contaminated soil and groundwater so I can do it more efficiently, more sustainably, to use less energy and time to clean them up. So here's just some examples of phase partitioning where the oil wants to float or it wants to sink. Here's something called frac sand when they're doing offshore drilling and they're introducing a frac sand to help open up all those fractures that creates the oil comes in. Here's just showing us some contaminated soils from a site. And here's actually a person just holding some of that. So we want to be able to manipulate the behavior of the floating or the sinking things, even stuff that we introduce to the environment so we can get that contamination off and make it clean again. Here's just talking a little bit about absorption. So if you can imagine we have a column full of soil or a box full of soil, and then maybe it's wet, and there's little spaces in between all the grains. We call those pore spaces. Well, the oils, when they don't dissolve, because they don't like dissolve water very much, they want to either float or sink. Well, the other thing they do is they stick to the soils called absorption. And when they're absorbed with the soils, they're not very available. Even bacteria have a hard time breaking down. We know bacteria is really good at breaking things down, but if it's stuck to the soil, it doesn't work so well. Even if you want to pump it to a well, it doesn't work so well. That takes a long time. Or you want to chemically treat it by oxidation or reduction, that doesn't work so well. So I found a way of desorbing that off the soils or taking that floating or sinker layer and getting into solution. And when it's in solution, like I've shown in this red circled area, it's more available for physical, chemical, and biological remediation, above ground or below ground, totally enhancing the way in which they treat them. Now, I'm not that physical, chemical, or biological treatment process, but what I can do is I can enhance the ones that are traditionally being used. And that's important. So when you combine technology, just like in the medical field or combining computer programs, we get a lot of efficiency out of things. This is just a nice little quote talking about the importance of absorption. During the past decade, much discussion has centered on the unavailability of absorbed compounds to soil microorganisms. That's the bacteria that we want to break things down. It's generally now assumed that desorption diffusion of bound contaminants to the aqueous phase, water, is required for microbial degradation. Well, not only do we talk about biological processes here, it's true of the physical and the chemical. So by desorbing the contaminants, I'm improving those. Again, the focus on what I was trying to do. So improving their physical, their biological, and their chemical availability for a large number of treatment methods that are being used right now and are available everywhere in the world. So how do we do that? There's usually a floating layer or a absorbed layer of contamination here on the soil. And at a molecular level, we start to desorb that, but we don't encapsulate them. I often say that every molecule has an ear, a nose, an arm, a hand, a foot. Well, we can grab onto that part of the molecule and pull it into solution. We don't have to encapsulate it. Or put another way, if you think of yourself as an oil droplet and a ping pong ball being a surfactant, I don't have to cover you with 500 ping pong balls to get dissolved. That means that I can be more selective and I work at a very low concentration, so I'm more efficient, more targeted. So this is a way that over 99% of surfactants work. Well, if you encapsulate that, try getting at the contaminant when you're running through the water treatment system. You can't. It's difficult. Whereas in the case of what I'm doing, not forming what's called a micelle, I actually make it still available for oil water separators, membrane separation, activated carbon, all these traditional treatment systems that do not work if you create a micelle. So I found a way of doing this, making these contaminants available and still preserving the ability for us to treat that water so we can generate clean water afterwards. Because of that, we have a number of different formulations which are tailored to the type of contamination. Gasoline is different from diesel. If it wasn't, we'd put them both in our car. And then there's other types of contaminants, so we develop products to deal with each of those. And the other good thing is because of that selectivity I talked about, grabbing onto the ear or the nose or the hand of the molecule, we are very effective at a very low concentration. So I have clients applying our stuff at 1 to 2% in most cases. If there's a lot of contamination and they're a bit of a hurry or they want to be more aggressive, I might say go as high as 4%, but that's huge. We're talking a 1 to 50 dilution with water, so a little goes a very long way. Now, I'm going to talk about water, as I mentioned earlier. This is a bead of water on fine sand. Shouldn't it just go in? But it's not. What's going on? What you see at the macroscopic level speaks to what's happening at the microscopic level. So what I'm going to show you right now is the typical behavior of water. So the oxygen in the water molecule is a little electronegative, and the hydrogen, by comparison, is electropositive. So that's why the one water molecule is attracted to the neighboring water molecule, and it's like magnets coming together. And that's why when you jump into a belly flop on water, it hurts. Well, if you did a belly flop on ethanol, which is in beer and wine that makes us feel kind of happy, it wouldn't sting because it's 21 dynes for surface tension compared to 73 for water. So things behave differently. Well, we tend to think water is H2O. Well, it's a little more involved than that because the water is attracted to its neighbor and its next neighbor and its next neighbor. So what water really is a three-dimensional cluster. So you're trying to push and pull this cluster of water molecules through the soil. Well, that tends to be slow and sluggish, particularly if there's more finer grained soils in there. So if I could change that large cluster to be smaller, I can move better. So change the behavior of water, change the solubility of the contaminants. Improving physical, chemical, and biological remediation. We're creating some opportunity. That's all I'm trying to do, is create opportunities. There's a nice illustration of what we can do. So if we have contamination trapped inside some fine-grained contaminants, just like a fireman going to fire, you have to get access into the building. Well, we have to get access into the area of contamination. And by getting access, then we can take the contaminants out or make them more available for those treatment methods that we're trying to use. This is a nice little illustration showing, imagine that water trying to get into where those contaminants are at. It can't do it. So we have to change the size of those water molecules so they're smaller to deliver the IV cell in there to start desorbing things into solution so that they're more available to be extracted, maybe at a pumping well or to the bacteria or for chemical treatment. And doing so very selectively at very low concentration. And there's just a nice image showing some soils that were treated. I think they were around 40,000 parts per million, 30 to 40,000 parts per million at that refinery. And they're showing the soils afterwards, very clean. So interfacial tension, like we talked about, those two coming together, could be like the oil and the water. They just can't quite overcome it because of the 73 dynes versus the low surface interfacial tension of the contaminants. Well, when you start dealing with IV cell being introduced, you can start to change that. And you can actually get them to go across that so we can actually get them becoming miscible or supported solubility in the water. So now they're more available to remove those vapors if you're worried they're going to a building, or if there's contamination in the soil, you want to get off into the water and then remove it and treat it so that water's clean again. We can do that and protect the groundwater. They're localizing the contaminated area so it doesn't spread and impact more. And remember, 1 liter of contamination of a lot of petroleum products will destroy 1 million liters of drinking water. So it doesn't take very much. So whatever we can do to improve that is important. Here's a nice image showing heavy oil floating on water, us making it soluble so they could remove it more easily. The other image shows chlorinated solvents, which are heavier than water, very difficult to treat, and us actually making them miscible for extraction, saving the client tremendous amounts of time and effort to clean up those sites. What I'm going to show right now, I'm going to probably just show one animation here of a typical way we treat sites and how that goes. So an environmental consultant will get retained to evaluate a site. And what they'll do there is they'll determine the three-dimensional area where the vapors are, the soil and the groundwater contamination are from that spill. And based on that information, we can design vertical or angled or even horizontal wells so we can introduce the IV-Sol. And we typically introduce it by gravity injection, not pressure, so it's pretty simple at a very dilute concentration. We can even put things in the well to help make it go into the soil at a more shallower level or a very specific level. And once we inject it, we usually wait 24 hours to allow it to do its work to dissolve things and then extract it out. So we call that the push-pull process. And over a limited series of applications, you can imagine each application we're moving a certain amount of mass. We're moving a certain amount of mass. So the nice part about that is in a very short time period, you can clean up your site. I'll show another animation here. This is one, imagine we had a spill under a building or underneath a roadway, or we have a pipeline, or maybe a fiber optic line for communications, and the contamination in it. Well, you really can't drill in that area because you might hit or damage it, and you can't obviously tear down the building. So what we'll do in those scenarios is we do what's called a sweep process, where we put some wells into the ground on one side, we inject our products, which are being pumped to the extraction wells on the other side of the spill, and as the IV-Sol is going through, it's working on that floating or sinking product or that zorb phase, making it miscible so that mass can be removed, taking that very contaminated soil in between those sets of wells and cleaning it up to the regulatory standards so it's now safe. And again, through time-based water samples and soil samples, you can verify this has been effective for your site. The regulators will want you to. So they're just showing some examples of stuff that we've done, taking floating or sinking products, making them miscible, various types of soil contamination, even drilling waste and making them clean. This is showing in the bottom of someone doing a bioremediation pile, and we're spraying our products into the soil pile to desorb it so that their biological process, working with the bacteria they have, so it's more available so that works better. We also have clients that have large amounts of contaminated soil developing soil washing systems. We're using our products to desorb the oil off the soils. And when they're done, they're creating clean sands and clean gravels, which can be reused. Very sustainable. I want to get time to show a couple case studies. We'll see how far I get. And the first one I'm going to show is actually a Superfund site in New York City. This is interesting because it's a rail yard that's been in operation for over 100 years, long before we had environmental regulations. We've only been having those for the most part for the last 50 years. Anyway, with that said, there was a lot of surface contamination, soils and groundwater, a lot of that floating product of concerns. They actually had 6 operational units, being 6 areas they were trying to clean up. The area that I was working on with this client is kind of where my cursor is here. And I'll show you the treatment system where they were using this kind of system that could actually pull that vapors out of the ground, cool the groundwater to get in the dissolve phase, but also trying to recover some of that floating or sinking contamination. And they did that, and they wanted to see if we could enhance that process. So that's why we got involved in the project. This just talks about some of their cleanup objectives, but the biggest one that was driving the area where we were working was to remove that floating product that was at the site. They also had a little bit of what they call PCBs in the soils, and because we're selective, we were removing the hydrocarbons and not touching those, so that was good for the client. Here just shows their network of wells that they're pulling on to remove those vapors, dissolve phase, and free phase. And there's just an air photo. And this in the center is their treatment system, quite an elaborate treatment system. I think they spent, oh God, well over $500,000 to design that, that's for sure. And they were operating this for multiple years, and they wanted to see if we could enhance that process to make it more sustainable, more timely, and more cost effective. This graph is really important because between 2013 and 2015, you can see that at a certain point, they got, for a while, they're getting a lot of contamination, and then it started to taper off. Well, what's interesting for you that 84% of the contamination they got happened in the first 5 months. What about the rest of the time? We see this time and time again. You may get some initial good recoveries, and then the system tapers off. It's not that this multi-phase extraction system we're using is not efficient. It's actually quite good, communicates really well with the soil and groundwater contamination. But its problem is the stuff that was readily available it got, but that stuff that zorbed or that floating phase, it's a little bit harder for it to get. So the idea here was to introduce the IV-Sol to make those floating or sinking products more miscible and get the stuff off the soil so it's more available. And by doing that, then we could see if we could enhance their ability to treat that site. So let me show you some of the results. I explained earlier about how the IV saw worked, and the image here you see in the bottom is we had floating product. We want to see if we could make it miscible so they could remove it. They picked 8 of their more challenging wells on the site to do the initial pilot scale application. So we did some work in the lab first to prove it would work. Now we're in the field doing a 1-week pilot scale application involving 3 of those push-pull applications. We injected our product, waited 24 hours before we pulled it out. And the results are going to be shown in a moment. This shows a person doing a gravity feed injection. We actually have a way of evaluating the behavior of the water. So if you inject it at one well and you're pulling to another, and you want to see when the surfactant with all that liberated oil is coming to the well, we actually developed a field test kit based on surface tension. So you can actually do every one of these tests for under $1 US. Whereas if you send it to the lab, it could cost you probably $75 to $100 per test. And this is done in like 30 seconds, where the lab will be a week getting you back your numbers. So it's a good test. Here shows baseline water and water with just a trace bit of surfactant and contaminant being recovered. You can see the difference. So it's a very, very good test and very easy to learn and to use. What this graph shows is the thickness of product before and after we did the test. So we actually did this application in the latter part of the year. So it was in late October into the first week of November. So over about a 7 or 8 day period, 1 week. This is the thickness before and after each of those applications. But a better way to look at this is what was the percent mass removal at each. And here shows the percentage removal with an average of over 81% in this is just a pilot test to see if this was effective. Now, we did those applications in late October, and then they were checking things over time, and there was no rebound. It never came back after we removed it because it was gone. The good part is because of these favorable results, they got approval from the regulator. Then in late 2016 into 17, they got approval to go to field scale. That was nice. Some highlights of this is they found this is a very effective technology for removing of that floating phase contamination, which they couldn't get. They liked that we could apply it and then remove that mass out rather quickly. And whenever we remove that mass, they could see the effects happening like the next day. So that was really nice. They also tried higher concentrations, but they finally realized that simply as 1 to 50, the very dilute, was just as effective as putting in higher concentrations. So saved them a lot of money. And overall, this was a very effective way for them to treat the site, very simple, cost effective, and it paired well with their existing treatment system to enhance its ability to work. Oh, before I leave this one, they went to full scale, and it took less than 6 months to clean up the entire area. And not only did they remove all the free product, they went even beyond that to improve the soil and groundwater conditions beyond their requirements. And the site was redeveloped, which is really, really important. The next case study is one that's a little bit interesting to me because it had both contamination of diesel on the site and something called carbon tetrachloride, which is a chlorinated solvent. It's quite nasty. It's quite carcinogenic. So this is a presentation that was presented at Battelle, if anyone ever goes to that conference, and I'll share that story with you. What it is when they grow and they collect the grain, they put them in these tall silos. And to protect the grain, a thing they used to do was use these fumigants to actually preserve the grain and keep insects and things out from rotting it and destroying it. The unfortunate part was they were using things like carbon tetrachloride and carbon disulfide, and they were using those since the Second World War. And the concern on this site was they had an above ground storage tank with this product in it, and it leaked. It got into the soil, got into the groundwater, and it contaminated them. And remember, it doesn't take very much. It even takes less chlorinated solvents than even gasoline to destroy groundwater. Much, much less. Okay, bottom line is they impacted the soil and groundwater of the site. They also had a diesel spill at this site, so that was quite significant. And they found where they had the diesel, it was also commingled with some of this carbon tetrachloride. So they had 2 problems. They brought us in for the carbon tetrachloride, but we actually helped them treat both once we realized they had both. Why treat one problem when we can treat both? And we did so selectively. They, just like the last project I showed you, had a multi-phase extraction system with the ability to pull vapors, dissolved, and free phase. And we did a pilot scale application in 2015 and a full scale in 2016. And then I'll share some of the observed ongoing results into 2018. You'll notice in this site, it's in the United States, so you get approval for something, you show the results. There's a time delay before you get next regulatory approval. That'll vary from place to place. Sometimes it can be 3 to 6 months, and sometimes it's 6 to 9 to 12 months between steps in these projects. But the unfortunate part about this project or something I learned while I was doing this project, was that in 1978 alone in the United States, they used over 28 million pounds or 12.7 million kilograms of fumigants involving carbon tetrachloride. So if you're ever dealing with a site where they've had grain stored in these silos, whether it's at a port or at a remote or at some of these agricultural areas, and it was in existence and operating in, let's say, the 1960s and 70s, you might have some carbon tetrachloride to deal with. So here just shows some of those silos. You see 3 large ones and a number of smaller, high vertical ones in the background. And there's the multi-phase extraction system they had operating that could pull out all the contamination. But again, it got what was readily available. And there's a groundwater flow. So from the source, it was obviously spreading across the site. What this shows for you is their rate of vapor removal while they were operating. This is over a 7-year period, by the way. So they got about 9,100 pounds of about 4,500 kilos of carbon tetrachloride in the vapor phase. But in the dissolve phase, they only got about 33 pounds or around 15 kilograms. But to do that, they had to treat over 7.5 million gallons of water, and you would multiply that by 3.78 to get the number of liters. So heading towards about 25 million liters. So that's an awful lot. So from a perspective of how efficient and sustainable this was, it wasn't really doing the best, and it was probably cost them well in excess of $500,000 US per year to operate and maintain this site. So they wanted to see if they could enhance it. So here's the conditions they had on the site for the contamination of concern. And those red areas are well over 300,000 micrograms per liter. These are heavily contaminated. And after they had run that system for the multi-phase extraction system for that 7-year period, here's the difference. I'll repeat that. Here's the conditions in 2007. Here's the conditions in 2014. Huge amounts of that source contamination still remained there. There was huge risk to the client, and the site wasn't getting better after 7 years, and tremendous millions of dollars have been spent. So they brought us in to see if we could do a pilot scale application to see if we could improve this. And before they did that, one of the things the project manager did is he went in and did an investigation to see where the contamination was. These are very high numbers, 1.3 million, 3 million, 7 million micrograms per kilogram of contamination in the soil. So as I talked to you before, if it doesn't dissolve, it tends to stick and absorb to the soil. So these contaminants were either in globular form, trapped in some of the pore spaces in the geology, or stuck to the geology. So they had to get that off, and that's why they reached out to us to see if we could do some bench scale, then pilot, and full scale operations. So this is the pilot here. This just shows a cross-section of their contamination, which you're seeing in orange and yellow. As you notice, it's moving along horizontally. That's kind of where the diesel contamination is kind of holding some of that carbon tetrachloride up, where some of the contamination is also sinking because it's at a certain density. And there's some stuff in between, as you notice, right? So there's obviously an area of highest concentration they really wanted to focus on, and particularly where they had any of that floating or sinking phase of contamination. These are some of the wells that they picked for us to treat, doing that injection, waiting 24 hours and doing extraction. In a couple cases, we had an area we could only inject in one well because there was some underground structures or maybe the rail line itself, and we had to wash underneath it doing a sweep. And there I'm just showing the former underground storage tanks. You can imagine the area we're in is probably the highest concentrated area, which they're having a hard time trying to treat. So what I'm showing here is, here's where we did the pilot scale, and then here's where we did the full scale. What you notice is here is that we weren't getting very much, and we attenuated it there during the pilot scale. And then we learned from that, installed a couple extra injection wells to improve contact, and then you see this massive rise again, steeper than anything they'd ever realized in the previous 7 years. And the other thing too is, of all the contamination they had on that site that they removed in 7 years, we were able to get 25% of that out in a fraction of the time. So just showing that the rate was greatly enhanced. They had influent concentrations at their treatment system from after we injected our products to make the stuff miscible to recover. We're at 30,000 micrograms per liter, which is 5 times higher, or over 500% of what they were normally seeing. So we were obviously making this more available to the treatment system to pull out, which was our objective. And they were actually measuring that on site and seeing it happen in real time. That was important for them. So to kind of summarize this, here is the drawing again showing their conditions at that 7-year mark before we went and did our pilot and full-scale applications, which actually involved, I think it was 4 simple applications during about a 1-week period. And then we did, I think it was 5 larger scale applications, which happened, again, each of those are around 24 to 40 hours each, so a relatively short period of time. And here's the results. Look at the difference. I'll replay that for you. Here's the conditions after, remember I showed you before, and then after 7 years, they still had that hot spot. And here we are after as little as 8 to 9 applications of injecting our products, waiting 24 hours and pulling it out. Huge differences, huge. This was very, very important from reducing the risks of the site and the overall contamination. And they also found as we were applying the IV-Sol, we started to open up some of those pathways where, I say the oil gets trapped. By opening them up, the multi-phase extraction system could actually pull on the entire site much more efficiently and even draw in more contamination, mostly due to us. But even when we weren't doing the IV-Sol applications, it was still getting more contamination because we opened up all those blocked pathways, which is really great. So here are some of the full-scale results. They had a 98% carbon tetrachloride reduction in that source area. Remember, it was really red and then it got down to yellow. That was massive. They had a shallow diesel spill on the site, a shallow plume. Well, we actually treated that too and removed all that free product. Then they had also a 92% reduction in the source area of the multi-phase extraction wells. The other one was talking about all those monitoring wells that you don't see in the drawing, showing that massive reduction. So huge. And then there was significant reductions in the L-NAPL, which is that diesel fraction that was floating. That wasn't their main goal, but we actually eliminated that by over 99.99%. So that's good. I'm looking at my time now, and I actually have enough time to show you one more case study. This is from near Melbourne, Australia. So I'll go through it as quickly as I can because I just want to give you another view on an application. On this site, it was a former gasworks site that was in operation for almost 100 years, and it released a lot of, shall we say, vapor, soil, and groundwater contamination. And that's that one that I showed earlier on in my presentation where they had a baler, this tube. We had floating and sinking and all kinds of different density products in there. So it was a very challenging site to clean up. They tried a lot of things without success. They reached out to us. We did some bench scale studies, and then we did some very simple pilot, and then they went to full scale. So this is going to really focus on that full scale application. And this here is showing, again, when they used to have these industrial operations, these gasworks, they were typically on the edge or outside of the town. But like what happens over into a lot of major cities, the residential areas grow out into them. So that's what's happened here, but the contamination was still in the subsurface. So in this case, you can see the plumes of contamination when they were trying to get things, and they had a lot of that floating and sinking product in these areas, and they wanted to see that the IV-Sol products, those formulations we came up with to deal with all of those, could help enhance the vapor, the dissolved, and that free phase recovery. So their main objective was to remove that non-aqueous phase presence, and that they're using NAPL because it's not only L-NAPL, light, or D, meaning dense, it's a broad range of things, including a number of contaminants concerned like naphthalene, benzene, ammonia, cyanide, sulfates, and a few things to remove there. But they often found when you can remove one contaminant, it would drag the others with it. Okay, they want to remove and reduce contamination liability because remember there was people in the area, but also the client had obviously environmental liability, and they had regulatory pressure to clean up the site. As far as the model of the site goes, how well do they understand the patient? They had over 100 wells constructed on the site, so they had a really good understanding of the geology and the various layers, but also the three-dimensional shape and areas of contamination of this plume. So they really understood the patient. And for me, it was a joy to work with these guys because the better you understand the site through your characterization and your conceptual model, the easier it is to treat them. So imagine you had cancer, you go to your doctor and he decides to check how your heartbeat's doing, put the thing in. That's not going to be enough. You have to do some tests. Well, the better the testing they do, the better they can treat you. The same with a contaminated site. Here I'm just talking about how the IV-Sol works, which I've explained in the previous example, so I won't speak on it anymore, other than that we're going to take that sorb phase or that floating phase or sinking phase and make it miscible in water where it's more available, physically, chemically, biologically. In this case, more physically available for extraction by their multi-phase extraction system. Here's just an image showing some of the work area they had. And the key part is not only to see where they're working, but look at the proximity of some agricultural activity in that field in the back and some residences. One thing I'll give these guys credit for, they communicated very well and very openly. They were very transparent with the local homeowners about what they were doing and the results they were getting. And that made the people feel that no one was hiding any of the facts and no one was trying to do anything that was dishonest. And that really helped make everyone in the general area feel more comfortable with the process and what they were doing. Here's just kind of a nice snapshot. There's the baler they put down a well, and look at it. That's got that floating, that sinking, and those in-between density products in there. And as we started to clean up that site over that 6-month period, look at the baler. We got most of the floating and the mid-range stuff, and now we're dealing with some heavier compounds. So there's a bottle showing that they barely had anything left over time. And this is really nice that you can see that we started off with a lot of product, and as we started to optimize application, like inject it, how long do we wait before extract? How much do we extract? What concentration? We played with a lot of variables to see how quickly we could treat the site, the patient, and the contractor and the environmental consultant were really, really diligent about observing what they did and what the benefits were. Here's a nice graph they generated over 120 days showing what they did and the various application events and how they were attenuating mass recovery. The daily NAPL recovery to what they were getting over time. And the key point was we were observing when we did an injection, do we wait 24 hours? We actually found application to extraction was around 4 to 8 hours was optimal. If we waited 24 hours, we were still getting a lot out, but we found the more quickly we introduced it and the quickly we removed it out, the more we got out. So that was a really good thing to learn. And they kept observing and checking on the patient, just like the doctor comes into your office, comes into your room to check on you. But in between those doctor's visits, there's probably 25 to 30 visits by the nurse. In a sense, these guys were keeping a really close eye on the patient to make sure when we had to do something to intervene or improve things, we had a good understanding how the patient was doing to do that, which was resulting in huge savings of time and resources and making things move a lot more sustainably and efficiently. There's that baler we started with. There's the balers are going along. There's less and less stuff to, again, hardly anything in one of the sample jars. So big, big differences over time. So some conclusions, which are really important because they talk about sustainability as well, is the surfactant-enhanced aquifer remediation. Here we're dealing with soil and groundwater remediation. Was with the groundwater extraction can be a viable remediation method for these tarry or heavier compounds. And in this case, as I showed you, they had not only sinking compounds, but some denser ones. So it was a broad range of challenging stuff to deal with, which we were able to couple the IV-Sol formulations to deal with all of them. They were particularly happy that there was limited human environmental receptors. There was unconsolidated sediment, so very diverse. They had sufficient effective permeability. They liked that the water, the surface tension of the water could be reduced. So even where they had some fines, we could still get entry of the IV-Sol to desorb things and get it out. And they had good communication between their multi-phase extraction system and the contamination that was sorbed, as well as that free phase, or NAPL as they refer to it. From a sustainability perspective, it was less costly than other possible physical, chemical, and biological treatments, such as co-solvent, thermal, stabilization, all of which would have been quite challenging, expensive, and taken a long time. And remember, we started and finished this project in 6 months. Socially, very little noise, no odor concern, reduced street traffic because they didn't have to keep going to the project as often to get as much mass out. So it allowed them to be a lot more efficient in what they were doing. The IV-Sol, in addition to what I told you earlier, that we don't have any byproducts of concern, things like that, we're biodegradable to 3 international standards, including the ones that's recognized in Southeast Asia, North America, and Europe. Okay, because we don't cause emulsification of the oils, wastewater treatment systems still work to treat that water so it's safe after treatment for discharge or reuse. And sometimes those reuse can be agricultural or other industrial processes, but reuse is really important. Anyways, after we had that approximately 6-month period of treating the site, they were planning on shutting down the treatment system in late January this year, and they're currently going through that closure phase. And what you'll find with a lot of that regulatory closure phases, they don't happen overnight. They take a few months usually to make sure it's done right and that everyone's comfortable with the process. And also there's public consultation to make sure the landowners and the local population are comfortable with the process. But lo and behold, we did a tremendous amount of contaminant mass removal here in a short period of time, saving lots of time, lots of cost, reducing manpower, technological inputs, less gas consumption by the vehicles, less wastewater treatment to be done, less treatment system operation. We just really did a lot of sustainable stuff that net has a benefit for climate change because there's all those wastes that are not being generated. Really quickly, I'm going to take a moment here. There's another site that we have that we did at a remote site in northern Alberta. I'm not going to be able to talk on that one because I've got only about 5 minutes left in my presentation. But just to speak that we've even gone to sites where they're producing oil, okay? And they have spills as well. And this one, they had a spill of over 320,000 liters. And not only the spill happened, but it left their containment area, which you see in the bottom of this drawing, kind of where my cursor's at now, and it actually went down a steep slope, about 20%. Let's put it this way, you wouldn't want to take your bicycle up a 20% slope. It's very, very steep. And that contamination went down. The unfortunate part is there was a stream at the base of that slope. So they were concerned about the downward migration, impact of that forest, which was obviously of economic value, impact to soils, water. But that fish-bearing creek was a big concern for this client, and they wanted to do the right thing. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to just jump ahead on the presentation to just go past this one. I will show one slide here just for a moment. This slide shows you the spill area, and look at the steep slope and the pathways they were going along, and there's the river down here. And we used a bunch of interception, we call bell holes, or like little mini trenches. So when we were washing and cleaning the vegetation, it was actually being collected at those points for treatment, which was great. From a sustainable perspective, I'm going to jump ahead. I want to show you an image that's really nice. Is this one here. Here shows an area that they had that was contamination. Look at all the suppressed vegetation and the color, and look at here how quickly it's rebounding. This all happened within just days of treatment. It started rebounding rather quickly, and they were quite surprised by that and quite pleased, needless to say. I think the regulator was pleased, as was the client. Now I'm going to go back and just talk to you about when we're dealing with clients and they have contaminated sites anywhere in the world. We developed a pretty streamlined process. The first step is they obtain our electronic one-page site evaluation form so they can type the information in there. And the stuff that we're asking is stuff they typically should have. And then based on that, we can develop a model for underground treatment, or if they need to do above ground bioremediation or soil washing, we can design that. We also, looking at the type of contamination they have, determine the right IV-Sol formulation to use. What concentration should they use? Should they do a 1 to 50 dilution or a 1 to 25? But it's definitely going to be dilute, so they do the right dosage and they don't add too much and waste a product. Again, sustainability. And then they do their applications, and Ivy remains around to help interact with their clients, do that entire treatment process to make sure they have a nice, sustainable, cost-effective result. And we want success, not only success for ourselves, but our clients, because their success is our success. And contaminated sites are very challenging to treat, so it takes some clever people coming together and working really hard, putting their egos away and trying to do the best they can. So in summary, some of the most common IV-Sol applications are, again, that floating or sinking product, where we can do these push-pull applications or sweeps like I showed in the animation. We often will be coupled with other technology, bioremediation, multi-phase extraction, chemical redox type processes. And then we have some people that just use us to remove that free phase, and then they finish by a biological or chemical method, or even use a risk assessment by computer to determine if they removed enough mass to make it safe to stop cleaning up the site. We've also dealt with removing vapor intrusion. Imagine you had a spill and the vapors coming into the building. Well, we can treat that. That's really good. And sometimes when there's contamination that floats on the water and the water table goes up and down because we have rainy seasons and dry seasons, well, the water table goes up and down, creates a smear zone. We could treat that. And for clients that are doing things like bioremediation, we do surfactants bioremediation, chemicals, people doing soil washing above or below ground, we do that process. And then we can also treat organometallics and a bunch of other recalcitrant compounds. We're pH neutral, biodegradable, non-corrosive, non-caustic. So it's a very safe product to use. And we have a lot of, like we're REACH compliant for Europe, for example. The other thing I show really quickly on one slide is we developed another product for like cleaning field equipment. Here you're showing like drilling augers, or these are actually somebody's gloves from an oil and gas field, or a tarred up hard hat that had tar in it. We cleaned half of the client. And the bottom right shows a water level meter from a field site where before and after we did that in about 30 seconds. They spent 45 minutes not getting it off successfully, and we did that rather quickly with the Deconit. So even showing there's other REACH, other applications that we're trying to improve. So in closing, I just want to indicate here's my contact information. And for some people that are interested in learning more about remediation, I also participate about twice a month in something called Focus Remediation Seminars. And you can reach out to me. I can tell you how you can attend those for free. And they're very, very focused on technology. And I'll be presenting on one of those later this month, so feel free. But this is my contact information. I just want to thank you very much for making the time to listen to what I had to say today. And I hope this becomes helpful and sustainable remediation to your site, which ultimately is going to improve impacts to the climate. And thank you very much. Have a nice day.